He thought this would be the most powerful day of his life, but it was the day the truth chose him instead. The chandelier lights spilled across polished marble floors, reflecting a room filled with tailored suits, diamond necklaces, and carefully rehearsed smiles, the kind that only appeared when power gathered in one place, and everyone knew exactly who held it. Ethan Cole stood at the altar, 6'2", still as carved stone, his black tuxedo cut with precision, his presence alone enough to quiet an entire room without a single word, and beside him, Victoria Hayes glowed in white silk and flawless confidence, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if she already owned everything he was and everything he would become. Outside, a soft California breeze moved through rows of white roses, the scent drifting into the open hall. But inside, the air felt heavier, like something unseen had already entered the room and no one had noticed yet. At the edge of the reception area, moving between tables with a tray balanced carefully in her hands, Naomi Carter kept her head slightly lowered, her uniform simple, her steps quiet, trained to disappear into the background of wealth she would never belong to. Yet her fingers tightened around the edge of the tray, not from fear of dropping it, but from the weight of the envelope hidden beneath it, a plain white piece of paper that did not belong in a room built on illusion. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times, each version ending differently, some with silence, some with security dragging her out before she could speak, but none of them felt as real as the way her heart now beat against her ribs, steady but unrelenting, like a countdown she could no longer stop. Laughter rippled from a nearby table where guests whispered about stock deals, private jets, and destinations measured in miles Naomi had never traveled, their voices blending into a distant hum, because all she could hear was the echo of a hospital room from years ago, a quiet cry, a signature forced onto paper, a truth buried beneath convenience and money. She glanced up, just once, her eyes meeting Ethan's from across the room, not long enough to challenge him, but long enough for something unspoken to pass between them, something that made his brow shift almost imperceptibly, like a man sensing a change in weather before the storm arrived. The officiant's voice carried smoothly through the hall, practiced, calm, guiding the ceremony forward as if nothing in the world could interrupt what had already been decided. And Naomi took one step forward, then another, each movement small, almost invisible, yet leading her closer to the center of a moment that would not remain untouched for long. Her hand slid beneath the tray, fingers brushing the envelope, feeling the sharp edge of truth pressing back against her skin, and for a brief second, she hesitated, not because she doubted what she held, but because she understood exactly what it would cost to reveal it. Around her, no one noticed, no one cared, because to them she was just a waitress, just another shadow passing through a perfect day, but shadows, when placed in the right light, can expose everything. And as the words "speak now or forever hold your peace" began to form in the air, Naomi Carter lifted her gaze, her posture straightening just enough to break the illusion of invisibility. And in that quiet shift, something in the room changed, subtle, almost untraceable, like the moment before glass shatters, when everything is still and then never the same again. The words hung in the air, gentle yet absolute, as if the entire room had been waiting for someone brave enough to answer them. And Naomi Carter stepped forward before the silence could seal itself shut again, her shoes barely making a sound against the marble floor, yet every movement drawing attention she had spent her entire life avoiding. And one by one, conversations faded, glasses paused midair, and heads turned not with curiosity at first, but with irritation, because someone like her was not supposed to interrupt something like this. Not here, not now, not in a room where everything had been planned down to the second. A man near the front frowned, whispering something sharp to the woman beside him, while another guest let out a quiet laugh, the kind that carried just enough volume to sting without being called out. And Victoria Hayes shifted slightly, her perfect smile tightening at the edges as her eyes locked onto Naomi with a cold precision that did not match the softness of her gown. "Excuse me," Victoria said, her voice controlled, polished, but edged with something harder beneath. "This is a private ceremony." The implication was clear, and it did not require raised volume to land, because everyone in the room understood the hierarchy without it being spoken, and Naomi felt it, the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders, telling her to step back, to disappear, to remember her place, but she did not move. Instead, she held the tray steady, her fingers now resting fully against the envelope beneath it, and for a brief moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant rustle of fabric as guests adjusted in their seats, waiting for someone else to correct the disruption. Security, a voice called softly from the back, not urgent, but dismissive, as if removing her would be as routine as clearing an empty glass, and two men near the entrance straightened slightly, exchanging a glance before starting forward, their movements efficient, practiced, used to handling situations without drawing attention. Naomi's throat tightened, not from fear, but from the awareness that this was the last point she could turn back, the last second before everything changed, and she thought of the years she had stayed silent, the moments she had chosen survival over truth, the nights she had replayed the same memory over and over, wondering if doing nothing had been its own kind of betrayal. "Please," she said, her voice not loud, but clear enough to cut through the tension, and something in the way she spoke made the security men slow, not stop, but hesitate, just enough for the room to notice, and Ethan Cole's gaze sharpened, his attention no longer divided between ceremony and obligation, but fixed entirely on the woman who refused to leave. He had seen disruption before, had dealt with people who tried to insert themselves into moments that did not belong to them. But this felt different, not chaotic, not desperate, but deliberate, as if she had chosen this exact second with intention that could not be undone. Victoria turned slightly toward him, her hand tightening on his arm, a subtle gesture, but one that carried urgency beneath its elegance. "Ethan, this is inappropriate," she murmured, her tone soft enough for only him to hear. But Naomi saw it, the shift, the first crack in the perfect image that had been so carefully constructed, and she stepped forward one more time, closing the distance just enough to stand at the edge of the aisle, no longer hidden behind tables or movement, but fully visible in a space that had never been meant for her. The envelope felt heavier now, not because it had changed, but because the moment had, and she lifted it slowly, not as a threat, not as a demand, but as something that simply existed and could not be ignored. The room fell into a deeper silence, the kind that did not come from politeness, but from anticipation, and Ethan Cole tilted his head slightly, studying her with an intensity that stripped away everything superficial, leaving only truth and the question of what would happen if it was spoken aloud. "Let her speak," he said, his voice low, controlled, and final, and in that instant, the entire room shifted its allegiance, not to Naomi, but to the possibility that something real had just entered a place built on appearances, and Naomi Carter, who had spent her life being unseen, finally raised her eyes without hesitation, because this time, she was not asking for permission. Naomi Carter did not rush, did not fill the silence with excuses or apologies, because she understood something that everyone else in that room had forgotten, that truth does not need to shout to be heard, it only needs to be placed in the right hands at the right moment. And as she stood at the edge of the aisle, the weight of every gaze pressing against her, she lifted the envelope with both hands, steady now, no longer trembling, as if the decision had settled into her bones and removed the uncertainty that had followed her for years. Ethan Cole did not move toward her immediately, but his eyes never left the envelope, tracking it with the same focus he would give to something that mattered, something that could change the direction of everything. And for a brief second, the entire ceremony felt suspended, like a photograph paused just before it developed into something permanent. Victoria Hayes took a step forward, her expression no longer perfectly composed, the softness gone, replaced by something sharper, something that tried to reclaim control before it slipped away completely. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice still elegant, but no longer calm. "Ethan, you cannot seriously entertain this." Her fingers tightened around his sleeve, a subtle pull, a reminder of the life already arranged, the future already decided. But Ethan did not respond to her, not yet, because something about Naomi's presence did not match the chaos that Victoria was trying to frame it as, and that difference was enough to make him wait. Naomi closed the distance by one final step, stopping just outside the space reserved for the couple, a line she knew she was not supposed to cross, but one she had already left behind the moment she chose to speak, and she extended the envelope toward him, her eyes meeting his fully now, without hesitation, without apology. "You need to see this," she said, her voice quiet, but grounded in certainty that did not waver, and the simplicity of the words carried more weight than anything louder could have achieved. Ethan reached out, not quickly, not impulsively, but with deliberate control, his fingers brushing the edge of the envelope before taking it from her hands, and the contact lasted less than a second, yet it was enough for Naomi to feel the shift, the moment when the truth left her possession and became something he could no longer ignore. Around them, whispers began to ripple, soft at first, then growing as curiosity overtook discomfort, guests leaning slightly toward one another, trying to interpret what they were seeing without fully understanding it, because nothing about this moment followed the script they had expected. Victoria stepped closer, her posture tightening, her voice dropping into something lower, more urgent. "Ethan," she said again, "do not open that." The request was no longer polite, and that alone drew more attention than Naomi ever could have, because it revealed something that could not be explained away with social etiquette. Ethan paused, the envelope still sealed in his hand, his gaze lifting from it to Victoria, studying her in a way he had not done all day, not as a partner, not as a future, but as a question he had not thought to ask until now. There was a flicker in her eyes, brief but undeniable, and it was not fear of embarrassment. It was something deeper, something that did not belong in a moment that was supposed to be perfect. The officiant shifted slightly, uncertain, his rehearsed words now meaningless in the face of something unscripted, and even the staff along the walls had stopped moving, trays held still, breaths quiet, as if everyone understood that whatever happened next would not just interrupt the ceremony, it would redefine it. Naomi did not speak again, did not push, because she had already done the only thing that mattered, and now the room belonged to the decision in Ethan's hands. Slowly, with a precision that made the moment feel even heavier, he broke the seal of the envelope, the soft tear of paper sounding louder than it should have in the silence. And as he unfolded the document inside, his expression did not change immediately, but the stillness in his posture deepened, like a man stepping into something he had not prepared to face. And for the first time since the ceremony began, the power in the room shifted away from wealth, away from status, and toward a single piece of truth that refused to stay hidden any longer. The paper did not shake in Ethan Cole's hands, but something inside him did, subtle, controlled, the kind of shift no one would notice unless they were watching closely, and Naomi Carter was watching, not with hope, not with fear, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who had already lived with the truth long before this moment forced it into the light. His eyes moved across the document once, then again, slower the second time, tracing every line, every number, every confirmation that could not be argued with, and the silence in the room stretched tighter, as if even the air understood that whatever he was reading did not belong in a place built on celebration. Victoria Hayes took another step closer, her composure thinning, her voice now edged with urgency that she could no longer disguise as elegance. "It does not mean anything," she said quickly, too quickly, the words stepping over each other in a way that betrayed their intent. "These things can be manipulated. Anyone can create a report like that." But Ethan did not look at her, not yet, because the document in his hand was not just paper, it was confirmation, measured, verified, undeniable in a language that did not rely on emotion or persuasion. Around them, the guests leaned forward in their seats, the earlier amusement gone, replaced by something sharper, something closer to discomfort, because this was no longer an interruption, it was a fracture, and no one knew how deep it would go. Naomi remained still, her hands now empty at her sides, her role in the moment complete, and yet she did not step back, because she understood that truth, once revealed, demanded to be witnessed, not abandoned. Ethan lowered the paper slightly, his gaze finally lifting, not to the crowd, not to the officiant, but to Victoria, and the look in his eyes was no longer distant or composed. It was focused, searching, as if he were seeing her without the filter of expectation for the first time. "When were you going to tell me?" he asked, his voice calm, almost quiet, but carrying a weight that silenced even the faintest whisper in the room. Victoria froze, Not dramatically, not with raised voice or visible panic, but in a way that was far more telling, her body still, her breath shallow, her mind clearly searching for something that no longer existed, a version of this moment where control had not slipped from her hands. Ethan, I do not know what she told you, she began, her tone shifting, softer now, carefully measured, as if she could guide the situation back into something manageable. But you are letting a stranger interfere with something important. The word stranger hung in the air, and Naomi felt it land, not as an insult, but as a final attempt to erase her presence, to reduce her to something dismissible. But Ethan did not turn toward Naomi, did not question her, because the paper in his hand had already answered what words could not. He stepped slightly away from Victoria, a small movement, less than a foot, but enough to create distance that had not existed before, and that space spoke louder than anything either of them could say. This test was conducted 2 years ago, he said, his eyes still on Victoria, and it confirms paternity with 99.9% certainty. The numbers did not echo, but they settled into the room with a clarity that removed any room for doubt, and a low murmur spread among the guests, no longer whispers of curiosity, but reactions to something real, something that could not be brushed aside with social grace. Victoria's lips parted slightly, but no words came immediately, and in that brief pause, everything she had built, every carefully placed piece of the life she presented, seemed to hang in balance. Naomi's chest rose slowly as she took a breath she had been holding for years, not in relief, not yet, but in acknowledgement that the truth had finally been spoken where it could no longer be ignored. Ethan folded the paper once, precisely, as if even now he refused to let emotion disrupt his control, but the stillness in his posture had changed, no longer calm in the way it had been before, but steady in a different way, like a man who had just stepped into a reality he had not chosen, yet would not step away from. The child you said you lost, he continued, his voice even, each word deliberate, is alive. And in that moment, the room did not just fall silent, it held its breath, because the truth had not only arrived, it had taken its place at the center of everything, and nothing that followed would ever return to what it had been. The words did not echo, but they settled into every corner of the room with a weight that no one could ignore. And for the first time since the ceremony began, no one moved, no one spoke, because the reality standing in front of them had broken through the illusion so completely that even the most practiced composure could not restore it. Victoria Hayes did not collapse, did not raise her voice, did not create the kind of scene that people expected when secrets surfaced, and that was what made it more unsettling, because she simply stood there, her expression tightening in small, controlled shifts, her mind racing behind eyes that no longer held certainty, only calculation. You are misunderstanding this, she said finally, her tone quieter now, measured with precision, as if she could reshape the truth by choosing the right words. That situation was complicated, and it was handled the best way possible at the time. The explanation was careful, but it avoided the center, and Ethan Cole noticed that immediately, because he had built his life on recognizing when people spoke around something instead of through it. His gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering, not angry, not loud, but resolute in a way that carried more authority than any raised voice could have. Handled, he repeated, the single word landing with quiet force, and the distance between them, though only a few inches, now felt like something far greater, something that could not be closed by explanation alone. Around them, the guests no longer whispered, because this was no longer something to speculate about. It was something to witness, and the shift in energy was unmistakable, the earlier celebration replaced by a tension that demanded resolution. Naomi Carter remained where she stood, her presence no longer dismissed, no longer invisible. But she did not step forward again, did not claim the moment, because this was not about her voice anymore. It was about the truth she had already delivered and the consequences that followed it. Victoria inhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting just slightly, and for a moment, she seemed to consider holding on to the version of the story she had maintained for years, the one that had allowed her to move forward without interruption. But something in Ethan's silence made that impossible, because he was not asking, he was waiting, and waiting left no space for avoidance. I did not think it mattered anymore, she said. And this time, the words were softer, closer to something real, but still incomplete. It was in the past. The statement lingered, but it did not resolve anything, because the past she referred to was standing in the present, undeniable, documented, alive in a way that could not be dismissed as something already gone. Ethan exhaled slowly, the movement subtle, but deliberate, as if he were grounding himself in a moment that had shifted beyond expectation. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm control, but with a clarity that removed all ambiguity. You do not decide what matters to me, he said, and the sentence, though simple, cut through every layer of pretense that had existed before it. Victoria's composure cracked then, not visibly to everyone, but enough for those closest to see the change, the realization that control had slipped beyond her reach, that the narrative she had built could no longer contain what had been exposed. Ethan's hand moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, as he reached for the ring on his finger, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to focus on that single motion, understanding instinctively what it represented. He did not rush, did not make it a spectacle, because this was not about creating a scene. It was about acknowledging reality, and as he slid the ring free, the absence it left felt louder than any declaration could have been. He placed it gently on the table beside him, not dropped, not thrown, but set down with finality, as if marking the end of something that could not continue under false pretenses. No one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would change what had already been decided, and Naomi watched quietly, not with triumph, not with relief, but with the steady understanding that truth, once given its place, does not need to fight to remain there. Ethan turned slightly, his gaze shifting past Victoria for the first time since the revelation, and for a moment, it rested on Naomi, not with gratitude, not with judgment, but with recognition, the kind that acknowledged her role without diminishing its weight. "Where is the child?" he asked, and the question did not carry anger, only purpose. And in that moment, the entire room understood that this was no longer about a wedding that had been stopped. It was about a life that had been hidden, and a truth that had finally found its way into the light. Naomi Carter did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because the question carried more weight than the room understood, and for a moment, she allowed the silence to settle again, not as hesitation, but as respect for what was about to be revealed next, because this part was no longer just about truth, it was about responsibility. Ethan Cole stood unmoving, his gaze steady on her, not demanding, not pressuring, but expectant in a way that made it clear he would not accept avoidance. And around them, the room seemed to shrink, the distance between people irrelevant now, as every ounce of attention focused on the exchange between a man who had just lost one future and a woman who held the key to another. Victoria Hayes shifted slightly behind him, her posture no longer aligned with his, her presence now separate, disconnected from the center of the moment, and though she did not speak again, the tension in her stillness remained, like a shadow that refused to fully disappear. Naomi drew a slow breath, her hands steady at her sides, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that did not seek approval. "He is safe," she said, and the simplicity of the answer did not lessen its impact, because it confirmed what had already been implied, that the child was not a memory, not a loss, but a living reality somewhere beyond the walls of this carefully controlled space. A faint shift moved through the guests, not loud enough to be called a reaction, but enough to show that understanding had begun to replace speculation, and Ethan's eyes did not leave Naomi's face, as if searching for anything that might contradict what she was saying, but finding none. "Where?" he asked again, this time softer, not because the question mattered less, but because the answer did. Naomi's gaze held his for a brief second longer before she spoke, not defiant, not submissive, but grounded in something deeper than either. "With the only person who did not walk away," she said, and though she did not name herself, the meaning settled clearly in the space between them, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Ethan's expression did not break, but something in his eyes shifted, not confusion, not doubt, but recognition, the realization that the truth he had just uncovered extended beyond a document and into years he had not witnessed, choices he had not made, and consequences he had never been given the chance to face. The room remained silent, but the silence had changed, no longer tense with anticipation, but heavy with understanding, as if everyone present realized they were no longer watching a disruption, but a reckoning. Ethan took a step forward, not toward Victoria, not back toward the altar, but toward Naomi, closing the distance that had separated them since the moment she entered his world, and for the first time, his presence did not feel like authority alone, but something more complex, something searching. "You raised him," he said, not as a question, but as a realization forming in real time, and Naomi did not look away. "I protected him," she replied, and the distinction mattered, because it carried everything she had endured without needing to list it, every choice made in silence, every sacrifice that had gone unseen, every moment she had chosen to stand between a child and a truth that had not been ready to be spoken. Ethan nodded once, the movement small, but deliberate, as if accepting something that could not be undone, and he glanced briefly at the folded paper still in his hand before looking back at her, the weight of both past and present now resting in the same place. Behind him, the untouched altar, the abandoned ceremony, and the quiet crowd all faded into the background of something far more important, because the direction of the moment had shifted completely, no longer defined by what had been planned, but by what had been hidden. Naomi remained still, not stepping closer, not retreating, because she understood that this next step was not hers to take, and Ethan Cole, who had spent his life controlling outcomes, now stood at a point where control meant something different, not power over others, but responsibility for a truth he could no longer ignore. And as the silence stretched once more, it was no longer empty. It was full of everything that had yet to be said. The silence did not break. It deepened, settling over the room like a weight that no one dared to disturb, because every person present understood that they were no longer witnessing a moment of interruption, but the quiet unfolding of something far more consequential, and Ethan Cole stood at the center of it, not as the man who had been moments away from a carefully arranged future, but as someone standing at the edge of a truth that demanded more than acknowledgement. His gaze remained on Naomi Carter, not with suspicion, not with distance, but with a focus that carried something new, something unguarded beneath the control he had always maintained, and for the first time, the authority he held did not feel like dominance. It felt like responsibility taking shape. "How long?" he asked, his voice steady, but no longer detached, and the question reached beyond time, beyond dates or numbers, into the space of everything he had not known. Naomi did not look away, because she had already lived through every answer that question required. "Long enough for him to ask questions," she said, and her words were simple, but they carried years within them, years of quiet explanations, careful choices, and moments where truth had been held back not out of deception, but protection. A faint shift moved through Ethan's posture, not visible to most, but undeniable to those paying attention, because the idea of a child asking questions about a father who had never been there was not something power could resolve. It was something that demanded presence, something that could not be negotiated or controlled. Behind him, Victoria Hayes took a step back, the distance between them now undeniable, no longer subtle, no longer something that could be ignored, and though she remained silent, her absence from the center of the moment spoke louder than anything she could have said. The room itself seemed to recede, the guests, the decorations, the ceremony that had been so carefully prepared all fading into something secondary, because the focus had narrowed to a single truth and the choices that followed it. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in thought, as if measuring something that could not be calculated, and when he looked up again, the decision was already forming, not rushed, not impulsive, but grounded in a clarity that had replaced everything else. "I want to meet him," he said, and the words did not carry demand. They carried intention, and that difference mattered, because it showed that this was no longer about control, it was about stepping into something he had been kept from. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her stance shifted, not resistance, not acceptance, but evaluation, because this was no longer about revealing truth, it was about what came after, and what came after required more than words. "He is not a secret you can step into when it is convenient," she replied, her voice calm, but firm, And the statement was not a challenge. It was a boundary, one built from years of protecting something that had never belonged to the world that surrounded them now. Ethan nodded once, the movement deliberate, because he understood that immediately, understood that whatever came next would not be given easily, and should not be. Then I will do it the right way, he said. And the simplicity of the sentence carried weight, because it was not a promise meant to impress. It was a commitment that would have to be proven over time. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for something beneath the words, something that could not be spoken, and whatever she saw there did not cause her to step forward, but it did not make her turn away either. Around them, the room remained silent, but the silence had shifted again, no longer filled with shock or anticipation, but with the quiet understanding that something irreversible had already happened, and that what followed would not be decided by status, or expectation, or the illusion of control, but by choices made in the presence of truth. Ethan Cole, who had entered the day expecting to claim a future, now stood facing one he had not prepared for, and Naomi Carter, who had lived in the shadow of that future for years, remained steady, because she had already learned that truth does not change who people are, it reveals it, and in that moment, there was nothing left to hide. The room did not return to what it had been, because once truth had taken its place, there was no version of the moment that could undo it, and even the light filtering through the tall windows seemed different now, less decorative, more revealing, as if everything in the space had shifted from display to exposure. Ethan Cole stood still for a second longer, not because he lacked direction, but because he understood that what he did next would define everything that followed, not just for him, but for a child who had grown without his presence, and for a woman who had carried that absence without asking for anything in return. He turned slightly, not toward the altar, not toward the officiant, but toward the people who had gathered to witness a celebration that no longer existed, and for the first time since the ceremony began, his voice addressed them not as guests, but as observers of a truth that could not be ignored. This ceremony is over, he said, calm and final, without raising his voice, and no one questioned it, because the authority behind the words did not come from status alone. It came from clarity, and clarity left no space for argument. A quiet shift moved through the room, chairs sliding softly, breaths released that had been held too long, but no one rushed to leave, because they understood they were still in the presence of something unfinished. Victoria Hayes remained where she stood, her posture upright, her expression composed once again, but the composure no longer carried power, it carried distance, as if she had already begun to separate herself from what had just unfolded, and when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, but empty of the control it once held. "You are making a mistake," she said, not loudly, not pleading, but stating something she could no longer enforce, and Ethan did not turn back to her, because the direction of his attention had already changed. Naomi Carter watched quietly, her presence no longer questioned, no longer dismissed, but she did not step forward, did not claim any part of the outcome, because she understood that dignity was not something you demanded recognition for. It was something you carried, whether others saw it or not. Ethan walked down from the platform, each step measured, deliberate, closing the physical space between himself and Naomi in a way that mirrored the shift that had already taken place, and when he stopped in front of her, there was no audience left in his focus, only the person who had changed the course of his life without asking for anything in return. "You should not have had to do this alone," he said, his voice lower now, not for the room, but for her, and the words were not an apology, not yet, but they carried the beginning of one, the acknowledgement of something that could not be undone. Naomi held his gaze, not softened, not hardened, but steady, because she had learned long ago that recognition did not erase what had already been lived. "I did what was necessary," she replied, and the sentence carried no bitterness, only truth, and that truth stood stronger than anything that had been taken from her. Ethan nodded once, accepting the answer without trying to reshape it, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to prove, only something ahead to face. Around them, the room slowly began to move again, but the energy had changed completely, no longer centered on celebration, but on reflection, on the quiet understanding that what had just happened would not be forgotten, not because of scandal, but because of what it revealed about choice, about silence, about the cost of both. Ethan glanced once more at the folded document in his hand, then back at Naomi, and the decision in his eyes was no longer forming, it was set. "Tell me where to go," he said, not as a command, but as a request, and the difference between the two was everything, because it marked the first time that power had stepped aside to make room for responsibility. Naomi did not answer immediately, but when she did, her voice carried the same quiet strength that had brought her here. "Not today," she said, and the refusal was not rejection, it was protection, a boundary drawn not out of resistance, but out of care for something that mattered more than this moment. Ethan did not argue, did not push, because he understood that immediately, and in that understanding, something shifted once more, something that could not be forced, only earned. The room, once filled with expectation, now stood as a witness to something far more lasting, and as the silence returned, it no longer felt heavy, it felt clear, because the truth had not just been revealed, it had been accepted, and acceptance, once given its place, does not fade. The room slowly exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition that something greater than expectation had taken place, and as guests began to gather their belongings with quieter movements than before, no one spoke loudly, no one laughed, because the tone of the day had shifted beyond celebration into something more reflective, something that would follow them long after they left. Ethan Cole did not turn back toward the altar, did not glance again at the place where he had almost sealed a future built on something incomplete, because his focus had already moved forward, anchored in a reality that demanded presence rather than performance. Naomi Carter stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her calm unbroken, but there was a stillness in her now that felt different, not tense, not guarded, but resolved, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been placed where it belonged. The distance between them remained, not out of hesitation, but out of respect, because both understood that what came next would not be decided in a single moment, and should not be. Across the room, Victoria Hayes walked away without another word, her steps measured, her composure intact, but no longer central, no longer part of the story unfolding, and no one followed her, not out of judgment, but because the gravity of the truth that had surfaced held everyone in place. Ethan watched her leave for a brief second, not with anger, not with regret, but with the clarity of someone who understood exactly what had been lost and why, and then his attention returned to Naomi, because that was where it needed to be. "I will be ready when you decide," he said, his voice steady, not pressing, not demanding, but offering something that had not existed before: time, patience, accountability, and Naomi heard it. Not just the words, but what stood behind them, the difference between a man used to being obeyed and one who was learning to be trusted. She gave a small nod, not agreement, not refusal, but acknowledgement, because trust was not something that could be granted in a moment. It was something built, piece by piece, through actions that followed words, and she had lived long enough to know the difference. The last of the guests moved toward the exit, their voices low, their expressions thoughtful, and the grand room, once filled with anticipation, now felt quieter, more honest, as if the space itself had shed something it no longer needed to hold. Ethan turned slightly, looking out through the open doors where the afternoon light stretched across the grounds, the same light that had greeted the beginning of the ceremony, but it did not feel the same, because the man standing in it was not the same, and neither was the path ahead of him. Naomi stepped back then, not as retreat, but as transition, her role in this moment complete, her responsibility fulfilled, and she did not look for recognition, did not wait for gratitude, because she had never come for either, she had come for truth, and truth had found its place. Ethan watched her for a second longer as she turned to leave, her figure moving quietly through the space she had once been invisible in, but would never be unseen again, and something in that image remained with him, not as a memory, but as a reminder of what dignity looked like when it stood without fear, without permission, without compromise. He did not call after her, did not try to hold the moment longer than it needed to be, because he understood now that some things were not meant to be controlled, only honored. The room fell into a final stillness as the doors closed softly behind the last guest, leaving behind nothing but the echo of what had been revealed and the quiet certainty of what would come next, and in that silence, something settled, not as an ending, but as a beginning shaped not by power, but by truth. And that day, without announcement, without applause, the world remembered what dignity looks like.